How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
In my decades of work helping build high-performing cultures, I've seen leaders approach the building process from a lot of different angles. Today on the Culture Architects Show, we're joined by a husband and wife team of researchers, Drs. Dennis and Michelle Reina, and they take us through the specific approach that they've developed for culture building. The Reinas have been studying the dynamics of trust since the late 1990s. And what their research across dozens of organizations shows is this, that trust is the essential foundation, not just for high-performing organizations, but for resilient teams and for healthy relationships in general. Of course, like all things culture-related, this trust never occurs by chance, but always requires some degree of, I would say, intentionality. The Reina's latest book, entitled The Art of Trust Building, Transform Lives, Teams, and Organizations, was just published in January of this year, and it delves into this. I'm excited now to have them with us today and to explore the overlap between the methodology that we've always talked about on the show and this framework that they've developed for intentionally building trust-based cultures. So Michelle and Dennis, welcome to the Culture Architects podcast.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, David. We were delighted to receive the invitation.
Well, that's great to have you. So just a little bit of background as a starting point. So before anything else, how did you each, you're both working on trust. How did you each get into this whole research topic and say, we really want to focus on trust? So Dennis, how did that come to you first?
Well, it actually came over 50 years ago when I was running the Mountaineering Center in Yosemite National Park, and I was climbing the walls. And if you're familiar with Yosemite, they've got some pretty big walls.
Yeah, it scares me just hearing you talk about it.
Right. Well, I'm 1,000 or even 2,000 feet up in the air. You realize from a very visceral kinesthetic level, the importance of trust, because you realize that your belayer has your life in his hands, and of course, vice versa. And unless you're, Alex Hunnell, who does, free climbing without any ropes, that's crazy making. But anyway, back then that was not heard of. And I understood trust from a very kinesthetic, visceral level, but I wanted to understand it from a very academic and more not only theoretical, but a practical and actionable level. And I went back to school. Okay. And that's where I met my bride 35 years ago on the dance floor. We fell in love, and we've been dancing together ever since.
So, Michelle, how did you get into studying trust?
Well, I also come to it, as we all do, with lived experiences from childhood and as we grow up. From a business perspective, how we got into it, quite honestly, David, our clients led us there. Yeah. And many, many years ago, what occurred is Dennis and I, coming out of graduate school, we put each other through our doctorates. We had, we were running a small boutique consultancy in the New England area. It may come as a shock to many people who are listening, David, but this is before there was the internet, and Wi-Fi and things of that nature.
Some people don't know that there was such a thing.
Somebody don't know that those times existed. We were, of course, the three of us were young, tiny little things at the time.
5 years old,
But organizations would actually ask us to come in and support them with some of the presenting dilemmas that we hear today. Leaders would ask us to help them to understand why teams were underperforming, why strategic initiatives were stalling out, why change processes were struggling to actually deliver. And at that time, we would be considered organizational generalists, if you will, with PhDs in, human and organizational development and systems. So we would often go in and do, the only thing we knew how to do at the time was talk to people. And what we began to discover through a number of organizations that we were working with is when we sat down and talked to people individual or in small group settings, there was a theme.
Yeah.
And it occurred again and again over a 2 to 3 year period of time in organizations that we were serving throughout the whole Northeast region. And people would say things to us like, I don't really trust my leader. We have a hard time working with this team down the hall, on the other side of the river. I'm not sure I can really trust my colleagues. So the primary theme that we would hear again and again is that trust was the ingredient that was holding them back from being highly self-directed to collaborating on problem solving in innovating a path forward. And leadership would often struggle to understand why their trustworthiness and therefore their integrity would be called into question. At that time, Dennis and I, went to work in understanding what their struggle was. But to be honest, we felt ill-equipped to support them to step into that struggle because we were living at a time in an era where there was very little really understood about trust. There was a tremendous amount of research and a lot of writing that stipulated how important it was, but there was very little available that would tell us how you really earned it, how you really developed it. So we used our doctoral dissertations to help us step into an understanding and begin filling those gaps. And when we completed our dissertations, we just kept right on going. And that gave the pathway for our own independent research and led to the publication of our first book in 1999. And from that point forward, David, that's been the focal point of our professional lives, and our clients continue to show us where we need to go, what they need, where their struggles are, how we can best support them.
Right. So I've always been a big fan of this topic as well, and have read quite a bit over the years about that and done work on that. And one of my favorite books, we actually did this we have a book group for our company too, where we're pick a book every month and study it. And one of the books that we read a couple of years ago, and it's one of my favorites, is Stephen M. R. Covey's The Speed of Trust. I assume you've probably come across that. And
yes.
I really like, when he talks about in that book, as I recall, I remember he calls it the trust dividend, that, when you have trust in a relationship, things happen faster. We just get things done better.
Yeah.
But I thought what was interesting in that book is the way that he breaks down some of the behaviors that contribute to trust, things like honoring commitments and transparency and things like that. And so I'm curious, as you've done your own research on trust, I come at everything from very much a behavioral perspective, that there are certain things that when we do these things, we tend to create more trust, and we do these things, we tend to diminish trust. What are some of the behaviors in your experience and research that contribute most to creating trust in relationships?
Well, what we've found, David, is that there are 3 dimensions of trust.
Okay.
There's trust of character, and the essence of that is we do what we say we're going to do. And then there's trust of communication. We openly and honestly and transparently speak with one another. And then there's trust of capability. We acknowledge and leverage the skills of one another in service to our clients, our customers, the end users of our services or products. Each of those work hand in hand. They're interrelated, those 3 dimensions. But for example, in trust of character, manage expectations. So often disagreements, breakdowns in trust happen when there's confusion or when there's unclarity around what was expected. I expected this. No, I wanted that, et cetera, et cetera. I wanted it on Tuesday. No, I got it on Thursday, et cetera. And so managing expectations is absolutely critical, along with, of course, keeping agreements. We do what we say we're going to do. We deliver as promised. And then and I'm just giving you samples of each.
There's 6 behaviors that contribute to trust of character. Dennis mentioned the manage expectations, keeping agreements. There's consistency in our behavior and how we delegate and how we look out for the best interest of one another. What we find about trust of character is that's the building block for alignment in synergy, where people are able to, kind of get on the same page, if you will.
And then there's, of course, go ahead.
I was just going to say that as I'm listening, I'm thinking about, I hear everything through the lens of what we call fundamentals, behaviors that we teach in organizations. And you're naming a number of them that we teach all the time. And so two of them that you just named, and I'm thinking of a third. One we call honor commitments. Do what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it. When people honor their commitments, I trust them. When they don't, I lose trust. And I think about, we have a fundamental, we call them, that we teach in virtually every one of our clients, that we call get clear on expectations.
Yes.
When people don't have clear expectations, certainly it leads to misunderstandings, whether that creates lack of trust, depends on their perspective, I imagine. But certainly we're going to have, I say often that virtually every misunderstanding you can think of at its root is a misunderstanding about expectations. I thought one thing and you thought another. But I think about the honoring commitments, and I think about, in my first company, one of the things I used to say to people, recognizing how important honoring commitments is to creating trust, is I used to tell my sales team and account management team that when you're taking over a new client relationship, one of the first best things you can do is to make some commitments, even if they don't need them, just so you can start to build a goodwill bank account of, I'm a guy that does what I said I'm going to do. So you're meeting with that new client and they have a question. You say, I'm going to find that out and I'm going to get it to you by 3:00 tomorrow afternoon. Even if they don't need it at 3:00 tomorrow afternoon, so that you can call them at 3:00 on the nose and start to demonstrate, I'm one of those guys that when I say it, you can count on it. And when you build those kind of commitments, I've seen over and over again the impact that has on trust. But I'm also thinking about, so I'm listening to what you said, Dennis, that there's another behavior that we teach a lot that we call assume positive intent. And what I'm thinking about is those misunderstandings that come, as you're describing, from lack of clarity about expectations. It would seem to me that that doesn't necessarily have to create mistrust, but it could, depending upon whether I assume positive intent. In other words, maybe I thought you were going to do something on Tuesday and you thought it was going to be on Thursday, and that's why we have missed each other. But that doesn't necessarily mean I don't trust you. It's just we had a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
If I'm assuming positive intent and I think you're a good person, I'm likely to hear that misunderstanding as, oh, you know what? We just weren't clear with each other. If I don't assume positive intent and we missed each other, I might think, that big jerk, I can't believe it. Look what he just did to me. And so how I view that misunderstanding of expectations would seem to me to have a big impact on whether that leads to mistrust or not.
Well, absolutely. And in fact, under trust of character, we have what we call mutually serving intentions. Okay. That I've got your back, you've got my back, we're in this together, win-win, perspective. And you're absolutely right, David. When you think that, the world is out to get me, or he stabbed me, or he's going to stab me in the back, et cetera, then that's the perspective, and that what gets transmitted to the other person, whether it be intentionally or unintentionally, whether it be consciously or even unconsciously. And so it's important to really go in, particularly in a trusting environment, or you want to create that trusting environment, to go in with an air of openness, a sense of, hey, we're in this together. And yeah, there'll be problems, there'll be challenges, there'll be opportunities, but we'll work them together. We'll work them out, supporting one another in service, again, to our customers or our clients.
Do you think that when I think about trust, let's think about it from a workplace perspective. Do you think that people come into work as already having a foundation of being trustful, or do many people come in maybe because of their family experiences or previous work experiences or whatever, they bring to the table maybe an orientation to not trusting and some be more trusting? Does that impact how they approach things, that their background and history?
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
It can. I'd like to just circle back real quick, if I may, to this dialogue you and Dennis just had about commitment and expectations, which I think is just so, as you say, foundational. One point I think is helpful for us to acknowledge to those who are listening is that, as human beings, we're imperfect. There are going to be commitments.
Wait a second.
Except for maybe the three of us who might be considered self-actualized. But, at the end of the day, there are going to be some marks that are missed. And what we found is that actually failing to keep an agreement can strengthen trust based on how we respond to the failure to keep that agreement.
Yes.
Do we act like nothing happened? Do we sweep it under the rug, or do we acknowledge it? I loved this question you just asked, David, about how we might bring ourselves to a relationship. What you moved into is a very cornerstone aspect of our work around trust building, which is where it begins with each and every one of us, our capacity for trust. And we all have a readiness, a predisposition based on life experience of a readiness and a willingness to step into a situational construct where we may be ready and willing to extend and give our trust to that other person. Others of us may have a need to, kind of wait and see a little bit. We're just uncertain. We might want to see, are they going to deliver as promised? We might want to wait and see, are they going to be focused on their expectations and their needs, or are they going to have an interest in my needs as well? Are they going to freely share information that will help me be successful, or are they going to be focused on what I can do for them? So there are some of us, I'm talking in simplistic terms, who have a more expanded, I'm ready, I'm going to give, I'm going to give. And others who are, I'm not quite so sure, I'm going to wait and I'm going to see. Now, I loved your follow-up is, how does that contribute to trust? Whether we're in that place of having a more expanded or a bit we need to hold back a little bit, what's most important is that we be aware of where we are and what our needs are so that we can make choices in how we behave. So we may be pulled back a little bit more, yet we are still behaving in ways that are trustworthy. We may feel a more expanded readiness and willingness that might more easily influence behaviors that build trust. At the core of that is really our relationship with ourselves and what we're noticing that we need in that context of that relationship.
It's our awareness that comes into play here, and that influences our willingness and our readiness to trust or not. Okay. And it really starts from way back when and through our developmental years, et cetera. Our capacity for trust begins, and then it's either further built or either strengthened or not, depending upon our experiences.
Yeah, as you're saying that, that's what I'm thinking about is I hear stories. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a very stable family situation, but I hear stories of people who maybe learned early, sadly, that maybe their parents weren't there for them, or they had disappointments in whether it was how they internalized, who knows, maybe it was a divorce, or maybe it was much worse. It could have been abuse or whatever. But if somebody grew up learning you can't trust people, it must be much more difficult for them to learn to extend trust. And if you grew up in a family where it was pretty stable and people did what they said they were going to do and your parents were always there for you, and you just somehow, I'm imagining you somehow internalize a sense of the world is generally a place where you can trust people. Doesn't mean every individual circumstance, but if you generally look at the world as most people are good and most people can be trusted, I imagine that would profoundly change how you go into other relationships versus if you grew up in a world where that wasn't your experience.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One of the things that I've found, we've talked about this with many of our clients, that I just find interesting in personal experience, is that I often say that trust, in my experience, creates an interesting burden of responsibility on other people. And what I mean when I say that is I think like if I say to you, Dennis, I trust you to do the right thing. Oh, now you're really stuck because you actually have to live up to that. If I don't trust you, you don't have as big a burden to live up to. And I think about, as a simple example of that, in my first company, I had several partners. And I remember when we were working on some shareholders agreements. And the attorneys would always say to me, like, do you want your other partners to like talk to their attorneys? I say, no, they trust me. If I tell them to sign it, they'll sign the darn thing. And I always recognized that put a burden of responsibility on me. They trusted me to do the right thing for them. And they weren't going to check with other attorneys. They were just going to tell me, David, if you say sign it, I'll sign it. That puts a big burden of responsibility on me to live up to the trust that they've given to me. And I find that really fascinating that if you say to your children, I trust you to do the right thing, they're kind of screwed. They actually have to live up to it. If you don't trust them, they can try to get away with things. Yes. And so it's interesting to me that extending trust seems to place a responsibility on others to live to a higher standard. Does your research support that?
Well, our research says that trust is reciprocal.
Okay.
Yes, you have to extend it. You have to give it in order to receive it. But and often in organizations, people look to their leaders and all. And while the leader's role is to initiate, trust building is everyone's responsibility. And that's an important, key factor, is that it's not just the person that yes, they're held to. Just Michelle and I, when you write books about, this is our 5th book on trust building. When you write books about, you're held to a higher standard. You've got to practice. And that's what we do. We strive each and every day. Do we always get it right? Sometimes we don't. But we're constantly striving each and every day to practice these principles that we not only write about, but we strive to live.
What do you find? So in that, I'll ask you this, each of you separately. So where do you struggle the most in your own relationships? Doesn't have to be bad with the two of you, but where's your spot, Dennis, that you find it most challenging, where you struggle the most in your trusting relationships?
I would have to say that to deliver on time.
Okay.
And most of the time I do, but sometimes, there's intervening variables that come up and so forth. But what's key is that we acknowledge those. Hey, something came, I can't make that, commitment by Tuesday, but I can get it to you by Thursday or whatever. What's important is that we acknowledge it rather than just let it blow by and say, sorry, I missed it, right. or even not even acknowledge that.
Yeah. When we teach what we call the fundamentals and the fundamental of honoring commitments, our definition of honoring commitments says we do what we say we're going to do when we say we're going to do it, and at the earliest possible point that we realize something might get in the way, we communicate and we make a new deliverable that we're going to honor.
Yes.
That's what you're referring to.
Absolutely.
How about, Michelle, for you, where do you struggle the most in trusting, in either creating trust or trusting others?
I would answer in this way. It's where I find myself growing in intentionality. And it comes back to the equation that you just mentioned a bit ago. Trust is not linear. So in your scenario of when we extend our trust to another person, it can be felt as an extraordinary responsibility, because when we hand something to somebody and ask them to carry it out, we are actually saying, I trust in you. We trust in you. And so as humans, typically we want to receive that, and none of us really wants to let anybody down. So I do have a bit more of a propensity to extend my trust. But what I'm very intentional about is not just a simple handoff. is to checking in. Where are you at with that? How are you feeling about that? What might you need from me? Do you have the right resources? Focusing in on that trust of communication, circling it back. Do you have the information that you need? How confident are you feeling at this moment in time? Where are you trusting yourself to carry this through? Where do you feel a little bit vulnerable? I may see something in them that they may not yet see in themselves. So when I extend something, I want the door to be open for them to express any kind of vulnerability or any kind of, I'm feeling a little bit, topsy-turvy. This is new to me. Oh my God, I've never done it before. So that I can be there to help them discover what I see in them. And I think for leaders in particular, or even coworkers, peers, often we can see something in another person that we've not yet seen in ourselves. So giving those opportunities and extending that vote of confidence is one part. But then there's that give and take, that reciprocity that helps them discover. And in doing that, what happens, David, it's in service to them growing in their own trust in themselves.
And that's really the essence of trust of capability, which is our third dimension, because people feel, wow, they trusted in me. As you said earlier, I'm going to deliver as promised, or I'm going to step up and so forth, because you can see something in them, as Michelle said, that they may or may not see in themselves.
It actually, quite honestly, David, I can bring Dennis and I into this equation. When we were in graduate school, he completed 1 year ahead of me, because you can imagine, a couple that has 2 young children, birthing a consulting practice, and putting each other through doctorate programs all at the same time. At a certain point, something's got to give. So I actually took a little bit of a hiatus for 1 year while Dennis actually completed his dissertation. And then we flipped and I went into my dissertation. And as we mentioned a little bit ago, each of our respective dissertations had a focal point on trust. That our doctoral dissertations earned us our PhDs, but it launched what became our life's work. As I was completing my doctorate, and I was literally coming out of my orals and getting my degree, et cetera, while I was working on my PhD, Dennis was actually working on a book proposal. And when I finished my doctorate, the very next week, he had us flying to San Francisco to have our first meeting with the publisher. So I'm sitting here and I'm thinking to myself, is he out of his freaking mind? There's no way I know how to write a book. Oh my God, I just got my PhD. I just want to take a nap. But he saw something. He saw something. And he literally took me by the hand and said, honey, we're going to do this. I did not have the confidence at that time. I felt very anxious and vulnerable, but his trust in me, his trust in the kernels that were emerging is what gave me enough to take that step, to take that step, to take that step. So I've learned from that, the power when we all see something in another person that person yet hasn't discovered in themselves, and how we help them trust that is extraordinarily profound.
Yeah. I'm thinking about your comments just a moment ago, Michelle, about the reciprocity of commitments. And it's reminding me of something I hadn't thought about in a long time, that there's a person that I learned a tremendous amount about communication, a man named Lloyd Fickett, who developed a communication practice called the collaborative way. And there were several components of that, honoring commitments being one of them. And one of the things that Lloyd used to say, and I hadn't thought about this in years till you just brought it up, is that when we make a commitment to somebody, it is a two-way street. And like you were just describing, Michelle, it's not just, all right, you owe me this commitment and I'm done and I wash my hands of it and it's now up to you. It's this, yes, we each have a role in this. And exactly as you were just describing, I have a responsibility to check in and see, do you have what you need? Do you have the resources? Exactly. Is there anything I can help you with? It's not just I wash my hands and you now owe me this commitment. And I think I usually think of it more as a one-way thing. And I've forgotten that it is a two-way thing and that we each play a role in that commitment.
Yeah.
And I think there's an enormous opportunity to deepen connection.
Yes.
And to deepen that reciprocity of trust and in how we respond to the commitment that has not yet been met. You know, a more classic linear approach might be something like, okay, you couldn't get it to me at this date. When can I expect it?
Yes.
A deeper layer of reciprocity is, hey, let's have a chat. I'd love to hear where's the struggle? Can you help me to understand what might be getting in the way? Are you okay sharing what is contributing to the miss? Not in a way that is a reprimand, in a way that is very compassionate, done with sensitivity and intentionality, because it is actually extending a lens of support. I am here to support. Is there something I can do to help you? If nothing else, it might give us a little bit of an opportunity to what might be occurring as a struggle that otherwise might not come into the equation. It doesn't necessarily mean we have to take it on or go to work on it. It just means that we have some sensitivity
and some
awareness, and we are able to keep the relationship healthy and whole and on course because we are honoring the connection, because that's what trust is doing, is helping us to connect more deeply on as people and on a human level that just accelerates, the work that we might do together.
Which is why presumably Stephen M. R. Covey calls it the speed of trust. Because it is an accelerant. If we trust each other,
accelerator.
Boom, let's go. You think about how much time is wasted when we don't trust each other.
Right.
Well, I got to double check in this, and I'm not sure about that. And what about this? And if I can just say, hey, we trust each other. Let's go. Let's move. An incredible amount of speed. I'm thinking back to Stephen M. R. Covey's The Speed of Trust. And what I remember from that book, and I don't remember it all, but you were talking about the three dimensions of trust, the character trust, the communication trust, and what was the other one?
Capability.
And I remember him, I think, talking about maybe two of those dimensions, and I hadn't thought about them in different ways that, I think the two he talked about would be your version of capability and character. And I remember him talking about, like, I could trust you to be a really honest person, and that doesn't mean I trust you to be my doctor and my surgeon if I don't have confidence in your skill set. And those are very different kinds of trust. It's one thing to say, I trust you to take care of me as a surgeon because I know that you have this skill set. That is a completely different aspect of trust than I trust your character. And I hadn't really thought of them as different forms of trust like that. But you're identifying really a third kind too.
Right. Well, and what you're talking about is appropriate trust. We're not talking about blind trust here. Okay. So often people think, oh, trust. I don't trust anybody, depending upon their capacity for trust and their developmental years, et cetera. Or others say, oh, I trust everybody, whatever, et cetera. The truth of the matter is we're talking about appropriate trust. Is it appropriate to trust in this situation, but not in this situation? Is it appropriate to lend a hand, et cetera, when they're struggling? Absolutely. And so those three dimensions come into play, and they're interrelated. And it actually started, over 3.5 decades ago with our research from our doctorate level. And then, as Michelle had shared, when we went to start, I started researching our first book, in 1995.
We then stepped into 67 organizations over a 4-year period and did some really rigorous research. And And that's when we discovered the complexity, David, that we're talking about. It's trust. It's lovely to have a conversation of this nature because it can help highlight. We're talking about some very complex dynamics, and that's what Dennis and I learned about in the research. And the attention of those three dimensions is to help take the complexity and make it understandable and actionable.
Well, and to give people a common language and a shared understanding so that they can take those behaviors off the page and put them into practice. And it's through that's what our latest book does. It really takes the concept and the abstractness of trust and makes it concrete, behavioral, and actionable, that people can literally say, oh, well, you know what? If I do share information and tell the truth and admit mistakes and give and receive feedback, that's trust of communication. If I acknowledge and leverage the skills of one another and help them and empower them to make decisions and help them learn and grow, that's trust of capability. And then, of course, we mentioned earlier, managing expectations, establishing boundaries, delegating appropriately, that's trust of character. All three of those work hand in hand. They're very integrated.
I know that in your book, you talk a good bit about, and in your research, a good bit about recovering from when trust has been lost in a relationship. So talk a little bit more about what have you learned about, okay, so somebody screwed it up and, we broke trust, whether that be in a personal relationship or business relationship, and it must be very difficult to reestablish trust. So what have you learned about how do you reestablish trust when it's been lost?
Well, first of all, David, what we have found that was actually quite eye-opening for Michelle and I in our research is that it's not necessarily the big things that break trust, but it's the minor unintentional, those little things. In fact, 90% of the ways that trust is broken is those minor unintentional ways. But they accumulate, they add up, and one day people check out and they walk out the door. They walk out, they leave the job, or they stay. And then they become, the quiet quitters or the working wounded, whatever.
Withdraw their best efforts it's where performance is most vulnerable to becoming status quo rather than firing all cylinders. It's just, we're just kind of as good as it's going to get.
Absolutely. Or, of course, today, in marriages and, while we've been together for many years and so forth, it takes work. And like any good relationship, if it's worth investing in, you invest in it and you honor it and et cetera. And
So that's
why the divorce rate is so
work.
high.
Yes. So when it doesn't work, so if you didn't invest in it and it didn't work and you now have lost trust, what have you learned about how does that get recovered?
There's I love this question. And I'll share that in the early stages of our research that we've chatted with you about, that was actually one of the questions that our clients have asked us. So when we share, clients have taken us where we need to go. One of the most prevalent questions is, what do you do when it's, become vulnerable? How do you get it back? So in our book, we actually have a full chapter dedicated to that and a behavioral construct that Dennis actually authored, which is called the 7 Steps for Rebuilding Trust. And the first is, David, there's got to be an acknowledgement that there has been some type of a breakdown or there has been some erosion. And quite often the tendency is, to kind of sweep it under the rug, to look the other way. People in leadership positions might just want people to, kind of move on. Let's get back to it. But what we find is that the whole process of rebuilding and at the core of it is healing actually begins when there's a safety, a container, either within an individual or individuals or a group or a team to first acknowledge, observe and acknowledge something has eroded here. Something has either broken down or something has become vulnerable. Trust is an emotional field. It is something that we don't tend to see or touch, but we all feel it. We feel it when it's present and we feel it when it's gone. So when there is the rebuilding process is observing, acknowledging what has happened that has caused trust to be vulnerable, and what emotions are we hearing and seeing? Is there frustration? There's a confusion. Is there hurt? Is there anger? But there are going to be feelings and emotions that any of us have as it pertains to what has caused the breakdown of trust. Those feelings and emotions, when they are honored, open the door for support. You know, we all need support in coming back from the loss of trust. Support for ourselves, and in some workplace settings, we need to support personal life as well. Everything we're talking about pertains to our personal lives as well as our professional lives. So support. Is it the support in the form of a coach? Is it support in the form of an open, honest conversation with the leader or coworker? In personal life, is it the support of a therapist? Is it the support of a good friend? But support is the vehicle, that container that can help us more fully understand what did we experience? What has occurred? What has been the impact on me? What has been the loss? What has been the consequence? What are these feelings and this feeling of unsettledness all about? But the real healing begins when we ask the magic questions that bring about the reframing.
Right.
Is there something else at play for me to learn here? Are there other circumstances that at play that would be helpful for me to understand? What might I learn and discover for myself and relationships? And David, a key step to the whole process of rebuilding trust is something that we've been chatting about, which is taking responsibility.
Right.
We do not always have responsibility for what happened, but we do have a responsibility to ask ourselves the question, is there something I might have done that contributed to this breakdown? The answer may be no. The answer may be yes. And if I did, what is my piece in this to own? So it's a pathway of introspection. It's a pathway of curiosity and seeking to understand. And it requires some courage to ask ourselves those questions and compassion to open the door for the human component that's at play.
And those 5 steps, they observe and acknowledge what's happened. Step number 1, allow feelings to surface. Step number 2, get support. Step number 3, offers the doorway to reframe the experience. What choices and options and opportunities do I now have? And then take responsibility. What's my role? What's not my role? What's mine to own? What's not mine to own? That opens the door then to forgiveness. Now, people often say, well, God, he stabbed me in the back. I'll never forgive him or her, whatever the case may be. It's first and foremost, you forgive yourself for putting yourself in that situation that allowed that circumstance or situation to happen, and then maybe to forgive it. But you never forget the lessons learned, and that's a key piece. You might never forget, but you don't forget the lessons in order to let go and move on. And depending upon the immensity or the intensity of the breach or the erosion of trust, you might cycle back through, God, I thought I was in the reframing experience. Now the feelings, a song comes on the radio and that triggers, the whole, or you might cycle through again and again and again. And these 7 steps actually came from my own healing process from a very painful divorce many years ago, long before I met Michelle, about 40 years ago. I was in a marriage and it broke up. It was a very painful one, particularly because our boys were 2 and 4 at the time. And it was hard. It was really hard, but I had to face what it was. It was also a turning point for me. While it was a loss on one hand, it was a growth experience for me on the other. Now, I didn't say that right when it happened, believe me. I was wallowing in my own stuff for sure, but I had to work it through. And it was through all of that. I looked back and I said, you know what? This is a process that not only helped me, but it could very well help others. And we've been employing it over the last 3 decades in our consulting work.
So I'm curious about, as we coming closer to the end of our conversation, I'm curious about, for each of you, in all the years that you've been doing this research and doing this work, what's the biggest surprise you found? Like where you would have guessed it's X, but it actually is Y when you look at the research. Dennis, for you, what surprised you most in what you've learned that you wouldn't have thought of before?
Well, I would have to say what I mentioned earlier was the fact that I was always, when you think of the word betrayal, big bad. In fact, the title of our last book was, Trust and Betrayal. I went through 3 editions of it. And I always thought it was the big, bad, and dark, nasty things that really broke trust. But in everyday life, it isn't that at all. They rarely happen, but it's those minor, unintentional ways that eats away at trust. It erodes it little by little, but big things happen as a result of that. And how
about for you, Michelle? What's the biggest surprise you found that you might have thought one thing, but in fact your research suggests something different?
I would say the significant positive impact that happens around our intentionality for any of us. And what I mean by that is, we've all chatted about 3 dimensions of trust and 16 behaviors that build those 3 dimensions. And the keys to sustainability is consistency in the practice of those intentions. But, we all are people. And it's not always easy to be a human being, and relationships take work. So what has been a surprise for me and a delight for us, because one of the things that we do, David, that we haven't chatted about is we actually assess and measure those dimensions and those behaviors. But what we've learned, what has been the biggest surprise for me is the dramatic impact that can happen when leaders and teams, people who are working together, go to work in a very focused and intentional way together. Perhaps on just 2 or 3 behaviors. It might be we're going to go to work on managing expectations, or we're going to go to work on speaking our truth, or we're going to go to work on acknowledging skills and abilities together. And we become intentional. Perhaps it's a 2 or a 3 month period of time. What's been my biggest surprise is the dramatic impact that can have all the way around, how it just lifts and rises everything. Because as Dennis said, the dimensions are interrelated. So the surprise that I have had, a delightful surprise, is to see how the intentional focus on the 2 or the 3 behaviors actually is a building block to the synergy of those 3 dimensions. And that has just been a really wonderful discovery. Again, through our clients, through our leader. We're there to serve them 100%. Right. That's our focus and our dedication. But we learn from them too. And that's been an extraordinary discovery.
And in our book, actually, right in the end of the first preface, is that we actually give a free assessment, the individual trust scale, and that is a starting point for people to really assess the level of trust in their relationships, how trustworthy they feel they are, with all the uncertainty and the ambiguity, et cetera, in the world. And we actually encourage people to take it, then read the book, and then take it again. And they get a very robust feedback report. It only takes 5 minutes to actually finish the assessment itself, but they get a very robust feedback report that really takes them through those 3 dimensions and plenty of coaching tips depending upon how they rated themselves.
It's a starting point, David. We all need one.
We all need one.
That's great. Well, I appreciate that. This has been a fascinating conversation. It is very consistent with and in sync with the things that we teach, in our own work about the fundamentals. So many of those behaviors that we teach align exactly with the behaviors that you're describing that lead to trust. And certainly it's been my experience, like yours, that when we build more trust in relationships and organizations, we get speed, we get effectiveness, we get greater productivity. Things just work better. Remember, somebody recently said to me, and I've thought of this analogy before, they were describing, I was doing a workshop and I was asking people, what would be the impact in your organization if you applied the things that you learned today about the stuff we're talking about? And they said that there would be less friction in the organization. I thought that was an interesting word to use and makes a lot of sense, that when we have trust and when we do the kinds of behaviors that lead to trust, things work more smoothly. It's like it's like a lubricant in the organization, that everything just works better instead of all this friction that ends up happening when we don't have that trust built. But it's all about the behaviors that lead to it.
The other component to it, if I may share briefly, as I know we're coming up on time, is that there's two points I'd like to offer. Is we are living today in a world of disruption that is unprecedented, across the board, and it's shared globally. The pace of change, the ambiguity, the uncertainty. What trust building does, when these behaviors are practiced consistently and trust building is at play, it has an interesting way of bringing some consistency and continuity to a state of change. And yes, things can be accelerated and performance is heightened and deliverables exceed goals and objectives. But there's something else equally important that unfolds, and that is quality of life. That is the joy and the satisfaction that can come to people's lives. Because when they go to work, they're leaving home. And when they leave home, they're going to work. And, so what we find that is another really wonderful element that brings tremendous joy and satisfaction to Dennis and I is, yes, these behaviors help business and performance, but trust building brings that satisfaction to life, and how people bring these behaviors home in the relationships with people that they share their life with. And that's in service to the full human being. That's pretty cool when you put it all together.
Yeah, because trust building, it's universal, and it applies whether we're at work or at home, whether in our professional life or in our personal life. It's universal.
Yeah. This has been fascinating. So again, for our audience sake, Dennis and Michelle's most recent book is called The Art of Trust Building: Transform Lives, Teams, and Organizations. We'll make sure in the show notes for the podcast that you've got that contact, and we'll make sure that you have Dennis and Michelle's contact information so that you can learn more about them, do the assessment that Dennis and Michelle referred to, so that we can learn more about our own status of trust and be working on that. So Dennis and Michelle, thank you so much for joining us on the Culture Architects podcast.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, David. It's been an honor.
And that wraps up today's episode of Culture Architects. If you're enjoying these conversations, subscribe on your favorite platform, and also consider leaving a quick review, and that way other culture-minded leaders can find the show. And for more tools on building a high-performing culture in your organization, visit CultureWise.com. See you next time on Culture Architects.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.